welcome to this video about risk perception and risk communication. Some people have an intense fear of flying, despite the fact that the statistics show that it's very safe to fly. They perceive the risk as high. Why is this the case? If we want to understand and explain observations like this, we need to look further into what we call risk perception. Shortly explained, risk perception is a person's subjective judgment or appraisal of risk, taking into account social, cultural, and psychological factors. Hence, a person's risk perception can be different than professional judgments about risk. In contrast to risk perception, professional judgments about risk are not to include feelings, nor conclusions about risk acceptability or unacceptability. Risk perception can in some cases identify aspects of risk which are not properly reflected by the professional risk assessments. People's concern could be justified, although the analysts have not yet identified the problem or they have judged it to be unimportant. The point being made is that the risk perception is not only about feelings, it can also capture conscious judgments of uncertainties and hence risk. A historical example is the risk related to nuclear power plants, where the experts argue that the risks were relatively small on the basis of statistics and probability numbers, and people's concern were all about perceptual aspects. However, the risk perception was also capturing important aspects of risk for which the professional judgments at that time basically ignored. This figure illustrates the difference between risk, professional risk descriptions, and risk perceptions using the terminology from chapters 2 and 3 of the book. The risk perception may be influenced by the professional risk judgments, the person's own professional risk descriptions, if the person is able to do this, how the person judges likes and or dislikes aspects of risk, feelings, trust, and acceptability issues. It can be argued that both professional risk descriptions and risk perceptions are subjective judgments of risk. Yet they are completely different, as discussed above. A professional risk judgment description is not influenced by feelings or, for example, how you like or dislike the consequences. The risk perspective influences the understanding in relation to the difference between the professional judgments of risk and the risk perception. So, if you adopt a perspective on risk of a CU, consequences, uncertainties, it would be different if you compare that with the professional judgment of CP, consequences and probabilities. The CU perspective has a stronger overlap in relation to risk perception because it's allow or appreciate more uncertainties than the CP perspective. In both cases, you have clearly the psychological factors, the fear, etc. The feelings are part of the risk perception and not the professional risk judgments. But there are aspects of conscious judgments of risk also in the risk perception, and that is more appreciated in the CU than in the CP perspective. Inspired by the development of the coronavirus in 2020, we can think more generally about the emergence of a possible pandemic caused by a new type of virus, where the uncertainties about the seriousness of the virus is large. We learn from risk perception research that the epidemic hits all the hot buttons for a high perceived risk, and there's a potential for misjudgments of the risks and even overreaction. These buttons include lack of control, catastrophic potential, delays in effect, new and unknowns, summarized by the two dimensions dread and newness. We talk about the psychometric paradigm. It's a model that identifies a number of factors that contribute to varying perceptions of risk, which are categorized into two main categories: newness and dread. So, for example, the hazard related to downhill skiing scores low on both newness and dread, while hazards like radioactive waste and nuclear reactor accidents score high on both, leading to a higher perception of risk for this type of events. Now, returning to the pandemic case, we need to question how is it possible to conclude that we misjudge the risk given the large uncertainties. There exists no true reference at this stage of the development that we can compare with. There were some public concerns in relation to the coronavirus as early as February 2020. It turned out that these concerns were justified and that the indications about overreaction and misjudgments of the risk were unsubstantiated. Of course, public concerns are not always right and the experts wrong. The point made is that we should be careful concluding that the people overreact or misjudge the risk when the situation considered is subject to uncertainties. Rather, we should acknowledge that the risk is amplified, but the reason for this could be that the professional risk judgments have not adequately reflected all risk aspects. If we dive into the risk perception concept and risk perception research, there are many other aspects that are interesting to study. One of them is what we call heuristics, which are cognitive techniques or mental shortcuts that we apply when we are assessing the likelihood of some event to occur. One example is the availability heuristic. The assessor's probability assignment is to a large extent based on the ease with which similar events can be retrieved from memory. Events where the assessor easily can retrieve similar events from memory typically lead to higher perceived or judged probabilities than events that are less vivid or unknown to the assessor. If a person daily reads in the newspapers about people getting infected by a virus, the person could easily conclude that there is a high likelihood of being infected, not necessarily in line with the conclusions made by professional risk assessors. In order to understand how and when these heuristics come into play, the distinction between System 1 and System 2 thinking is useful, or what is often referred to as thinking fast and slow. This dichotomy is often referred to in relation to risk perception, and it's basically a theory stating that our minds operate in two different modes of thought. System 1 thinking is a process that happens automatically, intuitively, and effortlessly. And this mode of thinking is to a large extent driven by heuristics. The other mode of thought, System 2, is slower, more logical, and more deliberative. Let's take another example, also linked to the pandemic. It's March 2020. The pandemic has been declared. There is much uncertainty about the disease. Societies worldwide are on the verge of lockdown, and this woman, let's call her Jane, is in the supermarket shopping toilet paper. After filling up her cart, she walks towards the cash register to pay for her items. But there are a lot of people shopping for toilet paper this day, so the area around the cash register is extremely crowded. When she sees this, Jane immediately reacts by backing away from the crowd, because the impression of such large number of people gathered together made her uncomfortable, and her quick intuitive System 1 thinking led her to move away from the crowd. After this initial reaction, she takes a moment to consider the situation if she decides to get in line with the other people. What are the risks and uncertainties, and what are her options? So, she applies the more logical System 2 thinking, and based on this evaluation, she decides that the risk is so low as it's acceptable to get in line with the others. Now, the distinction between System 1 and System 2 not only gives us some useful insights into where the heuristics operate, but also help us understand why there's often a gap between people's perception of risk and the professional judgments of risk. Because while risk perception is often strongly influenced by System 1, the professional risk judgments are based on System 2 thinking. A large part of the research on risk perception has been focused on trying to explain this gap and understanding why lay people are concerned about some hazards but not others. Let's go back to the example of the coronavirus pandemic. As Jane gets home from the supermarket, she turns on the news and is met by a press conference where government officials are stating that a lockdown will be implemented immediately. The pressure to shut down the society came as the situation was somewhat chaotic, with potential for severe consequences, and the uncertainties were considerable, a situation which was in turn followed by effects on aspects like economy, health and work life. This process, where the initial response to a risk event triggers ripple effects that in turn affects the overall perception of risk, is explained by the so-called Social Amplification of Risk Framework, SAF. The SAF framework is used to explain how and why some risk or risk events that are initially assessed by experts as low risks still produce significant public concern that often has large societal impacts. We say that the risk is amplified. Risk amplification refers to increasing the judged risk, whereas risk attenuation refers to reducing the judged risk. Hence, risk amplification and risk attenuation always have to be seen in relation to a reference level, for example, the current level. The SAF has been extended in many ways. One such extension addresses the phases or periods prior to the amplification shown in the traditional SAF. Risk may be attenuated for years, signals downplayed or ignored, risk not part of political discourse in the media picture, risk assessment and regulations unaffected. Studying these phases and periods could be critical for understanding the later risk amplification. One of the factors that is often discussed in relation to the SAF framework and risk perception in general is trust. Trust affects how one understands and perceives risk and risk events, as well as the risk response. For example, Jane's perception of the risk related to COVID-19 will be influenced by the degree to which she trusts the government and the health officials. But the relationship between trust and risk perception is not straightforward. Risk scientists discuss how much of an influence trust really has on risk perception, and we should also ask what is actually a healthy level of trust. It can be argued that some type of critical trust is what one should aim at, not blind trust, just accepting what is expressed. A critical trust combines a general reliance on a person or institution, but at the same time also a critical attitude towards them, a skepticism in relation to them. This is a common definition of risk communication. It covers exchange or sharing of risk-related data, information and knowledge between and among different target groups, such as regulators, stakeholders, consumers, media and the general public. I will start with this example from risk assessment when I was working in the industry, and we were presenting the result from that risk assessment to top management. And I showed management this figure showing the number of fatalities for certain categories, 1 to 2 fatalities, 3 to 5, 6 to 10, and more than 100, and with related probabilities, frequencies. Now, one of the managers was asking me, what does these numbers really mean, and what about uncertainties? That was a very good question, I would say. I mean, they were supposed to use a lot of money for improving the safety for this facility, partly based on this risk assessment, so they needed to understand what was the message here and how strong was that message. So the problem was not him asking, but the problem was that I was not able to actually to provide a very strong, good answer. I was not able to communicate risk in a convincing way. And the reason for that was that the foundation of the risk assessment and the understanding of the risk assessment foundation was not really clear enough. Now I am able to give a clear communication of what the message is. But at that time I could not do it. And I have to say, a lot of risk analysts still struggle with presenting, communicating the result in a way that is clear on the concepts and what they mean and how we have to deal with uncertainties in relation to these numbers. There are different functions of or aims of risk communications, and you see a list of them here. I will not read them all. You see that this is also in the book. But broadly speaking, we say that the main aim of risk communication is to improve the understanding of the risk in order to make appropriate judgments and decisions. Okay, so some words about the figure 7.1 with the 4 elements of risk communication processes: exposure and attention, understanding, evaluative reactions, and behavioral tendencies and behavioral responses. When it comes to exposure and attention, look at that figure on flood warning, flood alert, severe flood warning. There's a lot of work on design and format features of risk messages to attract people's attention. What I like to highlight here is the understanding and acceptance. And returning to my example, when I worked in industry, I was presenting the result to top management from the risk assessment, and the managers had problem in understanding the message. And the reason for that was that I was not able to communicate in a clear way the fundamentals. There was a lack of clarity on the basic concepts of risk, uncertainties, and probabilities. And that is often the case when people are communicating risk. There's a lack of foundation on the key concept, and that has implications for the understanding of the risk. I will give another example also. And that relates to the climate change risk and the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So, for many people, the IPCC is indeed a credible and trusted source, and you can say that they have been successful in the sense that more governments now are taking serious action in line with the main conclusions from IPCC. So, again, it depends on what is the purpose of the risk communication. For here is the in relation to making action, it can be seen as successful, but I will argue that it is not necessarily successful from a risk science perspective. We have done some work to investigate the IPCC work in relation to the Risk Science Foundation, and we conclude that there are some serious issues, challenges in relation to that foundation when it comes to the fundamental concepts of risk, probability, and knowledge strength, confidence, as they call it in the IPCC context, and the relationship between these concepts. As an example, consider the statement from IPCC from some years back that the probability is 95%, expressing that it's very likely that the global warming trend is a result of human activities. What does this statement mean? It's not explained in the IPCC reports, and how can you then be successful in relation to communicating this important statement? Because this is a very important statement, but there is no explanation what probability means. How can you then explain and convince people about this message when there is no interpretation of the statement probability of 95%? It matters greatly whether this is a statement reflecting some objective physical phenomena in the world, or whether it is a judgment about uncertainty, a degree of belief of some experts. In the former case, the probability is giving some higher, stronger authority than if it is just a judgment by some experts. But the former interpretation is really difficult to understand. Some objective physical phenomena in the world, what is it? It's hard to understand. The latter interpretation, a degree of belief, is more understandable, but needs to include then knowledge, strength, judgments, confidence, as IPCC referred to. But According to IPCC, probability and confidence strength knowledge are separate dimensions and should not be integrated, in contrast to risk science knowledge. So how can this statement be communicated in a good way when there is not a clear understanding of what this statement actually means?